I was of a mind to summon Sergei for a good talking to. He'd been away all yesterday and had only just returned. I thought it best to get it over with before he took it into his head to run off again. He came into my study looking unsuitably cheerful for a man in mourning for a dead friend. He wore a peculiar, stuffed expression on his face that he'd never sported before, and seemed ready to burst from whatever was bottled up within him. "Sergei, about these trips you've been making to the village." That was all the opening he needed. It didn't matter to him that I was still speaking. The sound of my voice alone was enough to set him off. That's when the whole dismal story came bubbling out of him. He'd met a girl. Fuming with impatience, I was barely able to tolerate listening to his drivel about her endless virtues, beauty, and all the many traits men in love attribute to their women when the fever is on them. I'd heard it before from others. Sergei's variation on the theme was hardly original, and certainly less welcome. Gods! One would have thought she was the first female he'd ever encountered from the way he spoke of her. My reaction was, to put it kindly and say the least, cool. In addition to the ludicrousness of a von Sarovich coupling himself with a peasant, I was compelled to point out that he was destined to enter the service of the Church as the next Most High Priest. But the moral implications, the political repercussions, the sheer idiocy of this new direction he'd taken meant absolutely nothing to him. No word from me would change his mind or move his heart. He was well and truly besotted, blind and deaf to everything but her, and to the devil with his responsibilities and the rest of the world. We did not part on amicable terms. The truth be told, I was furious. Never before in my life had I been more angry with anyone and less able to do anything about it. Less than a week later, Sergei brought her up by carriage from the village for the first and last time. She had no family, having been one of the orphans protected and raised by the local church, and would now be chaperoned by Lady Ilona herself until the wedding day. It was my faint hope Ilona would be able to teach the girl enough about court etiquette so as to avoid any wretched embarrassment at public functions. I directed all the staff and retainers that her arrival was to be an informal event. She would be properly introduced to everyone at the dinner Sergei was giving in her honor that night. Those who could read the true meaning in this would see the wisdom behind it. If she turned out to be a total disaster, there was still time to declare her indisposed for the evening and postpone things. Sergei, the gods preserve his innocent heart, hadn't the faintest inkling about the business. He alighted from the carriage and helped her out as though she were an empress, and not a low-born orphan jumped up from the gutter by some quirk of the gods. I was just considering that her lack of a family was probably fortunate, in that they wouldn't be mucking about the court and being awkwardly in the way, when Sergei escorted her up the steps to present her. Then, all my disparaging thoughts fell away like dead leaves. She was, without doubt, the most beautiful girl I'd ever seen. As she approached, I came to see that she was as beyond beauty as a river in spring flood is beyond a drop of water. I felt myself drawn into the flow, swept under by the current, overwhelmed. I could almost hear the roar and rush of it, instead of my brother's voice when he spoke. "Strahd? This is Tatiana." The girl made a low curtsy. She wore the simple homespun costume of Barovia, but she wore it like royalty, and her copper-colored hair like a crown. She made me suddenly believe in the folk tale of the kidnapped princess, raised by peasants, and eventually returned to her rightful place in the castle. "Welcome," I whispered, barely able to make my response. She raised her face to me, the clear skin, the great eyes, brighter than gems, and full dark lips had come together in such a way as to make all other women seem ugly by comparison. There was no comparison. She was unique. She was perfect. I felt my heart swoop and soar at the sheer joy of looking at her. This raised a blush on her cheek, and I instantly knew I must put her at ease. I took one of her hands, and she straightened, how like a tall flower she was, and with a bow, lightly kissed her fingertips. "Welcome to Castle Ravenloft, Tatiana. Be welcome, and look upon this as your true home, forevermore." My words seemed to go right to her heart, and her returning smile was like that first glimpse of sun after a bitter winter. All I wanted to do for the rest of my life was keep that smile on her, ever after. And then she looked at Sergei. It was as if the sun that had favored me had been all along hidden by a cloud. Its brilliant glory now shone in full upon him, and him alone. Custom demanded I tell Sergei of my plan to take Tatiana for a short walk before supper. After ascertaining that she was ready, I called at her room, and with one of Lady Ilona's acolytes walking in escort well behind us, took her down to the main floor and outside to the south courtyard. "There's the church. My home," she said, pointing. I didn't bother to look. To see the wonder and happiness upon her face was what I craved. Nothing else was important. "This is your home," I said. Her eyes turned to meet mine. "Thank you, Elder." I let it pass. "No more fears?" "None. I feel complete, somehow, in being here. Before I was happy enough, but it was as if only part of me existed, and I never really knew there was anything else. Only after meeting Sergei did I truly realize how much more there is to the world." I managed to keep my smile in place. "I feel alive and real for the first time. I believe now that all the life I'd led before was but a time of waiting until Sergei came into it." The last of the light faded, and the castle and valley lay both in darkness. I could hardly speak. My voice was a dry whisper like a desert wind. "You love him, then?" "More than the gods, more than myself, more than anything I've known, imagined, or could ever imagine. I hope you don't think it's wrong of me to love him so much." "No, not at all." She had just put into words that which I felt for her myself. I turned away so she could not see my face in the emerging starlight. Along with the sharp joy of love, I was being cut in two by the razor edge of utter hopelessness, and I was unable to keep the pain from showing. It was worse than any sword thrust, colder and more cruel than a blast of winter sleet upon naked skin. I could have cried aloud from the agony she so innocently gave me. To have such raw elements tearing through my brain and body was too much. I would have to tell her or die on the spot from the torment. I faced her and kissed her hand once more, my heart booming like a battle drum. What to say? How to say it? My throat was clogged solid with so many words that none of them could escape. In this darkness I was a tongue-tied youth of 20 again, and not the tempered warrior. I looked to her and held her gaze, and it came to me that she knew without having to be told. And just as swiftly I knew she did not. Reason fighting with emotion, and neither winning, such was my state of mind for this, the longest moment of my life. The madness passed, as the sheer impossibility of it overcame me. Everything in me had wanted to blurt out how I felt, everything but the small voice of doubt we all possess that causes cowards to flee and wise men to wait. I knew myself to be anything but a coward, and so it must have been some innate wisdom that insisted on silence. For me to speak now would only confuse and frighten her, and spoil any chance of making her forget Sergei and turn to me. Sergei. No. And I blotted that malignant thought out before it could complete itself. To even have allowed it to lightly brush against the most distant reaches of my mind was beyond dishonor. Something so shattering it was beyond evil itself. Elder? Her sweet voice brought me back from that abyss. Are you well? Of course I am. I lied. Sergei? I shook myself. Time to go in. Don't you think? I returned to the study and lighted some candles. The books Alec had brought back 6 moons ago had proven to be highly unusual and uncommonly advanced. Most of the lore in them was quite incomprehensible, and that which I did understand was dark. I suspected that the original writer of the books had participated in a number of ceremonies that would have met with disapproval from most of the magically talented. Certain diagrams, ingredients, and even the sound of the words of power made me decidedly uncomfortable, but the spells themselves were fascinating. And frustrating. During this time I experimented relentlessly on the simplest of them and met with failure again and again. As for the more complex spells, I was unable to even translate their titles. The language was outside my magical vocabulary. The reason behind this was to prevent any overly eager apprentices from jumping ahead in their education, thus heading off a disaster before its occurrence. The candles burned low and began to gutter. The shadows jumped as each flame struggled to remain alive against the flood of melted wax. Another night was slipping away from me, my last night, my last chance to have her. Blackness surged up and clouded my brain for a time. This had happened before and was becoming more frequent. I had thought it was simple illness before realizing it was but another part of my growing despair. Secret and safe in some hidden cache within me, the blackness was always ready to rush forth and resume, gnawing at my soul like a starved monster. It was a long-suppressed hatred toward Sergei, toward the life I was trapped in, toward life itself. Shuddering, I pushed it back. Time was short. I could waste none of it wallowing in such a useless self-indulgence. I bent over my book and tried to draw sense from it once again. 2 of the candles succumbed and went out at the same time, casting the pages in darkness just as some of the words were becoming clear in my mind. Impatiently, I grabbed up the book to take it to better light. The pages were stuck together now, probably by some errant blob of wax. I parted them, carefully. The words, suddenly crystalline, jumped out at me. A spell for obtaining the heart's desire. Gods! Why couldn't I read this one before this moment? I'd gone through these books 100 times. Perhaps the constant study was needed in order to obtain understanding. Perhaps only now was my mind able to discern the more difficult facets of the art. And this spell, this was the one I needed, had searched so long to find. My heart raced so from the possibilities that my chest ached. I looked at the list of ingredients, for without them it was pointless to start. Bat's wool, ground unicorn horn, yes, I had those. The candle flames flickered again. A curl of smoke drifted into my eyes. I blinked them clear and resumed reading. Bat's wool, ground manticore spike. That wasn't right. I started over. Rat's skin, ground manticore spike. On the 4th reading, I saw that it was useless. The spell's protection was too strong for me to break through. The last candles danced, flickered, and went out. I was in total darkness. I didn't bother trying to replace them. What was the point? Heart's desire. More like heart's breaking. It was hopeless. The answer to all my problems, the cessation of all my agonies, was in my hands, but I was utterly unable to use it. I might have to study for years before... Hopeless. Hopeless. Hopeless! It was too much to bear. I blundered over to the study table and slammed the useless thing down with all my strength. I wanted to slam other things, break them, tear them apart, tear the whole keep apart, starting with my idiot's collection of magical studies. Briefly, I scrabbled for the offending volume. I'd begin with it. That's a very old book. You should handle it more carefully. The voice, coming from everywhere and nowhere, took me cold. Hair on the back of my neck shot up. But long training overrode the initial shock, and I dropped to a fighting crouch, dagger in hand, before the last words were out. "Who's there?" I thought it might have been Alec's voice, only he would have grit enough for such a prank, but I wasn't sure. "You ought to know." Tatiana's voice now. Yet not her. It was behind, no, in front of me. "You called me," she continued, the sound moving first one way, then another. "I heard your hate. I am here to give you your heart's desire." "Stand still!" My tone was rather too harsh. Even in my great anger earlier, I would not have spoken to her so, and as for what she was saying to me... "Tatiana! Show yourself!" Sergei laughed in such a way as he'd never laughed before. You could never tolerate the sight. It was then I knew this to be an illusion born of magic. Whatever spoke to me was using their voices, hoping to frighten me by their very familiarity. But I was no trembling child to fear a noise in the night. I was... The laughter grew, filling the rooms, filling my head. I clapped my hands over my ears, dropping the dagger. Whatever was with me would not be vulnerable to such an insignificant weapon. I was dealing with something far beyond my experience in magic, and needed no wise teacher to tell me it was deadly. Yet it wouldn't have come without some type of summoning on my part, which meant I had a portion of control over it. Dispelling it was no problem. I knew how to do that easily enough, if I chose. "Strahd," Ilona now, whispering. "You called me. Don't you want your heart's desire?" "Don't you want your heart's desire?" Tatiana sweetly echoed. "Or will you let her go to your brother?" asked Sergei. "Will you let me go to your brother?" Tatiana questioned mournfully. Gods! It knew exactly what to say to me. "Will you let her go?" Alec demanded. "No. She will be mine," I whispered in my own mind. I couldn't not at least think it. They heard me, and laughed. "What will you do to get her?" Alec again. I refrained from answering, but it accurately picked up on the question in my mind. What might be required from me in turn? "Nothing beyond your means or skill, Strahd." I would have sworn it was Alec's voice, but for the fact that he'd never spoken to me with anything remotely like the contempt I heard now. "Shall we begin?" I gestured vaguely toward the table, wanting to buy more time to think. "But the right. I've not—" "Nothing beyond your means or skill," said Tatiana, in a tone that only an expert courtesan could use without insult. I felt her hand, or something like her hand, caress my face in a feather-light touch. I even smelled her scent on it. "Nothing beyond your means or skill," Sergei sneered, and the hand slipped down to close upon my throat. It was much larger now and smelled of battle sweat, blood, and oiled leather. I grabbed for the hand. It was gone as if it had never been. "What are you?" The voices merged and separated around, above, through me. They took on weight with no substance and pressed upon me. My heart pounded. labored. My blood seemed too chill and thick to push through my veins, and I cried out against it. The voices laughed at my pain, and in that sound they seemed to assume a single, huge shape. I was in total darkness. The shape was darker. It writhed and twisted and pulsed without rhythm, pleasure from pain, pain from pleasure, and it murmured of things still darker than itself, things I knew and things I did not, things that should never be said and were said anyway. And with each word it grew and grew, until the room was filled with its presence, and the sheer bulk of it pressed me down so that my knees crashed into the floor, and I was pushed flat. And the weight ground at me with pressure so great I couldn't scream, not even in my mind. Then it was gone. I rolled on my back, clawing at my chest where iron bands yet seemed to squeeze upon me, and felt nothing. No broken ribs, no burst heart. Not yet. But the next time, the thing would return and crush me into... I knew it now. Knew what it was. We were old friends. Death was in the room with me. My heart turned leaden. It would collapse in upon itself by its own heaviness. It labored hard against my breastbone, futile effort in the face of the inevitable. Death stirred around me like an ocean's tide. I fought to drag in one more breath. Death washed over and receded. For the moment. Have you come for me? If so, then take me and be damned. Nothing. I waited for many terrible, slow heartbeats. Then, I have come on your behalf. It answered, using all the voices at once. This was some last trick, a final taunt before dragging me into the abyss. You have fed me well, it continued. Gods, but wasn't that true? All those years of war, how many had I killed in the cause? What did it matter now? You are due your reward. Yes, I thought bitterly, another death for death. What other fate was there for a blood-steeped warrior when there were no more battles to fight? Your reward, Strahd Franzarovich, it emphasized. Reward? Then the voices assumed a secretive tone. Your hunger for your brother's betrothed, for your lost youth. I shall remove the rival from your path, and you shall age not one day more. Sergei, gone. Time removed as an adversary. Tatiana turning to me as I dreamed 1,000 times over, my heart's desire. It must be a lie, had to be. Could death lie? Why not? But why should it even bother? What was I if not one more mortal to fall spiraling into its bottomless maw? If you do as I tell you. There it was. The parley, the bargaining, the trade. What did it want of me? What could death possibly want from me? Nothing beyond your means or skill, Tatiana said clearly. The iron bands about my chest eased. I sucked in air, gasping, coughing. It had pulled back, but was not gone. I was waiting for my answer. I had no way of knowing for how long. Not long. It waited. Silent. I could hear nothing but the pant of my breath and the tiny creak of my own joints as I sat up. It waited 1 minute, 2. I wiped sweat from my brow. My skin was colder than stone. It waited, then began to draw back. I felt it going. With my only chance, my last chance, Tatiana. Going. What must I do? I whispered. It stopped, turned, and laughed. I awoke, sluggish and stiff, very late the following morning, and only because my servant took the liberty of violently shaking me to consciousness. My snarl of protest got the apologetic response that he had feared I was unwell, a conclusion readily confirmed by me in the barber's mirror a little later. I looked positively ghastly in the searing, bright daylight, and ordered the curtains drawn. The sun was out as if the storm had never happened, and there was entirely too much of it for me. No one else seemed to mind it, or the overbearing heat. And I found their cheerful attitude about the weather extremely annoying. I kept to my rooms, hardly able to move from bed to chair, as enervated now as I'd been energized the night before. Only in the late afternoon did I begin to feel like my own self and was able to tolerate a few necessary visitors. Time. There was none to spare. I shrugged the problem off as something to be dealt with later and got dressed for the wedding, white silk shirt, red neckcloth, stark black trousers and coat, and the von Zarovich ruby on my breast. All the others would be decked out in peacock finery and revel in it. I had never shared their taste for garish fashion and would not go in for it now. Knowing what was to come, I deemed their frivolous dress to be inappropriate. From the massive strong box that had held the ruby, I also withdrew a small bundle of elaborately embroidered fabric and tucked it into a pocket of my coat. It seemed to weigh no more than a feather, but insulated as I was by the layers of cloth and thread, I still felt the cold, dark magic pulsing from it, as though it lay right against my bare flesh. Sergei was done up in his gaudiest uniform, a soldier who had never really served. At least he had refrained from loading it up with assumed honors, as had some of the vain fops that were visiting the court. Other lords rewarded their servants with these trinkets, but I held the opinion that such things were to be earned, not given as bribes. The only bauble on Sergei was the priest's pendant, which he would have to ceremonially give up just before walking into the chapel. In his chambers, he greeted me with a broad smile and an embrace, and readily accepted the apology I'd prepared for him. How easily the words flowed from me. How happily he lapped them up. Yesterday's incident over Tatiana and the jewels was forgiven and forgotten, just like that. He still didn't understand. No matter. I went through the motions and said the right things. He babbled back in turn, displaying his nervousness for the approaching event. I watched him and looked hard into my heart, searching for a single vestige of warm feeling for this young man. Nothing. For all the fact that we shared the same blood, he was no different from any other strutting fool I'd ever encountered. No different, except that he was about to marry the one woman I loved, could ever love. "I wish you had someone like Tatiana," he enthused at me. "Oh, but I will." I took out the bundle of fabric. "For the groom I have a present," I said, handing it to him. "It's magical, and quite old, well suited to the day." Sergei's constant smile faltered when the red, black, and gold hilt seemed to leap from the wrappings. He went still as stone, gaping at the thing. Yes, Sergei was most definitely a sheep, vulnerable to any wolf who could put on a kindly face. "I see that you recognize it," I said. "The time-honored weapon of a Baal Verzi assassin. The sheath is made from human skin, usually from the weapon's first victim. The carvings on the hilt are runes of power. Had our roles been reversed and Sergei the one offering me such a gift, I'd have had my sword out and been backing toward the nearest door and calling for help. All he could do was stare with blank shock. One should never store a blade in its sheath, lest tarnish or rust set in, and this knife had not been out since that night I'd taken it from Ilya. But as I removed it now, the blade was as perfect as ever. It gleamed like a mirror in the candlelight and was razor sharp. The runes had their share of preservation magic as well as dark power. Legend has it that it is bad luck to draw such a dagger unless you can give it blood, I went on. Sergei's lips parted, but plainly he could not think of anything to say. This was something quite outside his limited experience. The Baalverzi. Deception was their greatest weapon, your oldest friend, your most faithful servant. By the gods, even the mother that bore you could be a Baalverzi. Even your own brother. I smiled warmly. I'm generally not superstitious, but I think this time it's better not to tempt fate, don't you agree? Moving swifter than the eye could follow, swifter than thought, I struck, driving the short blade up under his breastbone and into his heart. No man dies in an instant. For what seemed a very long time, he met my hot joy with a look of hurt astonishment. Then slowly, doubled over, silently falling into my arms. I felt the life thinly cling to him for a few seconds more, and then it just wasn't there. I eased his inert weight to the floor and worked the knife free of his body. Drink the blood, first from the instrument, and then of the chalice. Thus ran my instructions. After last night's business with Alec, this draught was nothing for me. Taking care not to cut myself on the blade, I licked every drop of blood from the dagger, dried it, and left it on the floor. Then I opened up Sergei's tightly buttoned uniform. It was a small wound, seeming hardly large enough for the amount of blood that had poured out. With his heart stilled, the flow had slacked off, but there was yet much to be had. I put my lips to the wound and drank. Its taste was satisfying. It was the sweet savory one keeps to brighten up the end of a dull meal. There was perverse warmth to be found in his cooling life. It renewed my energy and spirit, and I felt strength such as I'd never known before, tearing through my veins like heat lightning. Without, I heard the laughter of guests and clatter of servants, the whisper of long skirts and the tap of dress boots. Within, I heard the beat of my own racing heart. My fingers discerned the very warp and weft of Sergei's garments. I smelled the soap he'd used, and the sweat, light upon his skin, and the difference between wet blood and that which was already beginning to dry. It was as if I'd spent my whole life with my senses heavily wrapped in the thickest of cotton bandaging, and only now had it been stripped away, freeing me. Free. One more thing to do, though. A bluff here, a lie there, a blatant misdirection. I found my feet, stooped, and swept up Sergei's body, aware of its weight, yet able to ignore it. Raising it high, I balanced it a moment, one-handed, then let it fall. It landed with a bone-jarring thump, sprawling in a most natural and satisfying manner. His eyes were still open. They were the same blue as his uniform, the same blue of our mother's. Free. I knelt and closed them. "You were supposed to have been a priest," I whispered. "Why didn't you just do what you were born to do?" The thudding commotion I had just made drew attention, and Sergei's personal servant came through the door, but I'd heard his approach and threw myself over my brother's body, as though overcome by grief. I looked up and, in a fair imitation of one of my own rages, imparted the bad news to him. Like Sergei before him, all he could do was stare until my bellowed orders at last penetrated his skull. Then he departed quickly enough to summon help. Easy. Very, very easy. I tasted blood on my lips, and felt the stab of sudden worry. What had the man seen? Horror in his master's death would account for most of his shock, but what else? Mirror. There was one just over there. Sergei had been preening before it when I'd come in. Yes. There was blood on my mouth, my face. Bad. But if I cleaned it off, anything the man said could be discounted. A bluff here, a lie there. There was a basin of water on the table below. I scrubbed my face, cleaned my bloodied hands, dried off, then checked in the mirror. Clean. No need to fear. I was so pale. Paper white. Whiter. My very image was fading as I watched. My last sight of myself was of a man utterly consumed by surprise, utterly ludicrous, utterly laughable with his popping eyes and hanging mouth. Myself. Strahd von Zarovich. Faded. Fading. Gone. My Lord Strahd? Gone. My lord! The reflection only. I ran my hand against the mirror's surface and left behind finger streaks. Lord Strahd! I turned toward the intrusive voice. Tatra, a lieutenant now, stood just inside the door with several of his men. They were in their dress uniforms, boots shining, swords polished and held ready, and looked quite grim as they stared from Sergei's body to me. "Where's Captain Gwillem?" I asked in a shaken tone. This time I did not have to dissemble for my lies. Knowing I wouldn't like his answer, Tatra retreated into discipline and stood at attention. "No one has seen him today, my lord." "Then find him. He's in charge of security. I want to know how he managed to let a Baal Vertzi into the keep." I pointed at the knife, where it lay near Sergei's body. Tatra and the others recognized it and made the protective sign against evil. I dropped back a step, feeling ill for a moment, just as well. I was too close to the mirror, and they mustn't see. "But, my lord, isn't that the knife?" Tatra caught my glare and chose not to finish. "You think there's only one blade for the whole filthy guild? The one I took from Ilya Buckvold is still locked away. This one is—" I looked up, as though pouncing on a new thought. "Find Ivan Buckvold." Tatra was a smart man, else Alec would not have made him his second in command. As I'd hoped, he made the connection between Ilya's death and Sergei's. It was a very logical conclusion, a brother for a brother. His face set, he snapped a go-ahead to two of the men, and they obediently slipped away. I left 2 men guarding the entry to Sergei's rooms and made my way to the chapel. Crowds of guests slowed me, their faces pinched with worry, sorrow, fear, and curiosity should have annoyed me, but did not. I was as distant from them as a bird is from the ground. Just at the chapel doors, I was told that Tatiana had run outside into the garden. I was thankful for that, instinctively knowing that I'd not have been able to go into that holy place. The dark magic was upon me. I'd changed. But it was worth it. She awaited me. Soon. The day's warm air had turned chill, and mist was beginning to rise from the damp earth like restless spirits of the dead. Such thought was fancy only, but I did sense something else. Stirring, all around me, like a wind that one feels only in the mind. Magic. Necromancy. I'd done more this night than kill my brother and drink his blood. More had happened to me than had been promised. That business with the mirror was yet another price for me to pay, a price that had not been mentioned. No, not really. I'd ignored the possibility. There is a precise language to be used in such bargaining. Had I been more on guard and less eager to take what had been promised, I could have asked and gotten an answer. Too late now. One of Tatiana's chaperones hovered near the gate I'd come through. She was pale, but calm, and offered me an apologetic look, saying Tatiana would not let anyone near her. "She'll see me." Where is Lady Ilona?"
"Lord Delisnia was taken ill. She was called away to see to him some time ago."
"Fetch her." She left, and I slowly approached Tatiana. The candlelight within the chapel was more than sufficient to overflow the stained glass windows and spill out into the night. Tatiana was huddled in a pool of color from one of them, her white gown catching and holding gem-like shades of green, blue, gold, red. I looked down at her. If I'd had to kill a dozen brothers, drink a river of their blood to have her, I would have done so. She made no move, not even to wipe at the tears making salty trails down her cheeks. Her throat. Kneeling next to her, I put out my arms and knew the totality of joy as she at last sank into my embrace. I'd never before had patience for weeping, but now, as she clung to me and gave vent to the terrible grief raging in her young heart, I had only tender concern for her pain. She needed someone to hold her, and I was glad to do so. While I had seen much death in my time, she was still very much a child to it. Perhaps between those extremes we would find a place of comfort for us both. My strength, my love, all that I had was hers to draw upon. "Why, Strahd?" she whispered. "It's happening." This was the first time she'd ever used my given name. "Why? How could this have happened? Who?" She clung to me more tightly, doubled over from the weight of her sorrow. If I could have spared her from this, I would have. Her sobs were such as to break her in two, but there was nothing to be done about it now. "I cannot say," I murmured, not sure she understood the muted syllables, but knowing the droning sound of a familiar voice might help. "Whoever did it will pay, has paid. I promise you." Above her weeping, I heard the winds within me rise. They tugged at my thoughts, trying to draw me away from the bliss of holding her. I put my back to them, shutting my eyes against them and the thickening mist. But Tatiana straightened and shook off my arms. She glared up. The stars were still visible for the moment. "Why?" she screamed skyward. "Why did this happen? How could you do this?" She wasn't addressing me, but the gods themselves. I tried to take her back, but she only pushed me away and got to her feet. "Was it so wrong for us to love? Is that it? How could you have let us love each other so much and then do this?" "Tatiana!" I reached for her, wincing as I felt the raw agony coursing through her body. "We cannot question the will of the gods in these matters." "Who else, then?" she snapped. She avoided me and, pacing in a circle, still looking up, raising her hands high, "Tell me! How could you have let this happen? Tell me!" Then the burst of anguish passed, and she dropped to her knees. I went to her, gathering her easily into my arms as before. "Tell me," she said faintly. "Hush," I said, rocking her. She lay quiet for some moments, then moved again with fresh energy. "Lady Ilona." Her eyes were fever-bright. "I must get her." "She's been sent for. She must bring him back." I grew cold all over. "What are you saying?" "She's a great healer, and I've heard that sometimes. Oh, Strahd! She'll have to try. She'll have to bring him back. This was but a testing of our faith. He will come back. I see it now." So did I. All too clearly. Ilona might possibly be able to do it, but I could not allow that. "Tatiana." I took her head in both my hands and looked into her eyes. Ravaged as she was by her emotions, she was still perfect. Still the most beautiful girl I'd ever seen or ever would see. "Tatiana, Please do not get your hopes up. Lady Ilona will do her best, but you must know that it might not be. I've seen her fail more often than succeed.
But she will succeed this time. I know she will.
No, you do not. None of us do. Remember when they tried to bring back the Most High Priest Keir? He died and remained so because it was the will of the gods. No one was able to bring him back.
No, that has nothing to do with Sergei. He was murdered, and that was done by the will of some mortal, not by a god. Lady Ilona must try, otherwise I shall join him. I can't live without him, and won't.
Tatiana! She stopped raving and met my eyes. Listen to me, sweet girl. Listen to me. My voice sank to a gentle whisper, which somehow broke through to her, and kept her looking at me. Sergei is dead. He will not return. Not even Lady Ilona and all her people can change that. You must accept it. But accept it. Her great eyes clouded for many moments, but I felt a palpable link forming between us in that time. I'd touched her in a way more intimate than any joining of flesh. She would be mine. He is gone, but I am here for you. I will always be here for you. You will turn to me and know my love. She blinked, her brows coming together in puzzlement. Strahd? Yes. Now her hand came up. It was the same caress I'd felt last night in my study, only instead of a phantom sent to tempt me, this was the fulfillment of the promise made. Heart's desire. Oh, yes. By the gods, yes. Her eyes cleared, and awareness flooded them. Strahd. This time she said my name in a different way, the way one lover speaks to another. I'm here. I shall always be for you. Hearts. Now I raised her to her feet, her face tilted up to meet mine as I'd done in countless dreams before, my lips closed softly over hers. Desire. She returned my kiss. Hearts. Her arms went around my neck and her body pressed close, breasts and hips against me. Hunger. We broke off at the same time, but for different reasons. She to stare at me with all new thoughts, new feelings, and I in near pain for the swift beating of my heart. But along with the ecstasy of holding her, having her, I sensed the intrusion of other, alien forces at work around us. That mist had risen high, and the stars were gone. I could see within the garden well enough, but not far. The chapel walls were lost. Found. Yard by yard the mist was retreating. It was not natural, for it moved in a slow spiral as though we were in the vortex of a vast, grey whirlpool. Strahd? She drew my attention back to her, pulling me down for another kiss. I ran my hands through her thick, russet hair. My lips brushed over hers, then moved on back to her cheek, her chin, and finally down to the hot silk of her throat. She sighed at the touch, her breath coming sharply with that first surprised awakening of true pleasure. "My Lord Strahd." Someone called from the gate, his voice muffled and flattened by the mist. I ignored him. Tatiana's heartbeat was as fast as mine. I felt the blood rushing through her like the rolling thunder of a summer storm. Betrayal! He was blundering around us in the mist. Damn him! I roared in my mind. Tatiana cringed and stiffened in my arms. Strahd? What? Hush. He'll go away. I'll send him away. She shook her head. No. What are you? Hush. It's all right. Now she was fighting me. I released her, and she stepped back to gain her balance. Her breath came hard, like a spent runner's. Her hands went to her throat, where I'd begun to kiss her in earnest.
"Elder, what—"
Another shake of the head, as though trying to awaken from a heavy sleep.
"No, we must not do this."
I held my hand toward her, palm up. "It's all right. This is as it was meant to be." She wavered between taking my hand and remembering the illusion of a lost love.
"But Sergei—"
"He's gone. You will accept it and turn to me."
"Old one, he's dead. How can you say such things to me?"
"Because you are free. Both of us are free. Tatiana, beloved, I can give you—" Her face crumpled as the fact of Sergei's death overwhelmed her once more.
"No!"
Her grief would have to run its natural course. I saw that now. Any forcing on my part would only drive her from me. It would take time to bring her around, but I had time. I had more time than any man ever before me. I could wait, and would. "Strahd!" Several voices now raised to bellow out my name like the rallying cry they had used on the battlefield 3 years past. This time the shouts came from the chapel, along with the cries and screams of women and children and the crash and ring of weapons. What in the name of all the hells was going on? Tatra suddenly staggered out of the swirl of mist. His uniform was torn and bloody, and half of his dress sword had been broken away. "Betrayal, my lord," he gasped. "Delistnia traitors, killing everyone." "Come, Tatiana." I took her hand.
"No."
She pulled away.
"I'm staying here with Sergei."
This was no moment for foolishness. I grabbed her arm and started dragging her from the garden. The mist had drawn back, and the walls of the keep were visible again, the stars returning. Their light cast a silvery glow, almost like daylight, but Tatiana stumbled as though she couldn't see.
"No, Elder!"
She balked and tried to shake away.
"I will stay with him."
"For how long? You think they'll let you live?"
"I'm hoping they won't."
Now she did wrest from my grip. I lunged to catch her again, but she shied away and ran. I called her name. She seemed not to hear. She darted through the low gate leading to the overlook. "No, Tatiana!" I was right behind her, but she had the speed of a young deer. I snagged the trailing hem of her dress, but she tugged free with hardly a pause and made the low wall. Up in one bound. I clawed and caught only air. Gone. The mist had cleared from most of the mountain, but the valley was still hidden. Tatiana's frail figure dropped, spinning into that roiling white cloud. Tattered fingers of it stretched toward her like something hungry, and arms spread wide. She plunged head first into their grasp. She shrieked the whole way down. Sergei's name, my name, neither of us. I couldn't tell. I couldn't hear for my own scream. It bounced off the walls of the keep and was swallowed whole by the mist below, vanishing even as she vanished. Then silence. Then laughter. Its laughter, with all their voices, her voice. I screamed again to drown them out, beating my hands against my ears, but it was inside my head as well, and nothing could stop it. I fell away from the wall, fell to my knees. The blackness returned, greater than ever, covering me, covering the world, never to lift. Ever. I'd not known true despair until now. It weighed upon me, heavier than the mountain, smothering and crushing me into something less than dust. "A von Zarovich groveling?" the voices mocked. "No, just a man like any other. A man who has lost everything, who has nothing left. Nothing. A man broken by unspeakable pain." The agony was so great I did not feel the first arrow when it slammed into my side. The second caught me in the back, knocking me flat onto the ground. Pushing to my feet, I stared, uncomprehending, up at the towers where the shots had come from. Archers stood ready at the crenellations, their bows full drawn and aimed directly at me. More men crowded into the overlook, all in the Delisnia colors, all poised to shoot. And one after another, they did. I braced and took the arrows, welcoming them, knowing for myself the madness that had seized and driven Tatiana. It would end now. I would trade this small pain for the obliteration of the larger. No hell could possibly hold worse suffering for me than this. More arrows. Their searing shafts were nothing compared to the pain filling my heart, but they were too slow. I had to speed along to my death, even as she had. Grabbing one of the arrows, I wrenched it from my body, roaring with the burning shock. Blood rushed from the wound. Not as much as I would have expected. I pulled out another. Some of the men fell back. The bolder ones held their post and loosed more shots at me. I faced them, encouraged them, and drew out the shafts one by one, broke them in half. I was like a beast in a trap, gnawing off one of my limbs to free myself. Finally, weakening, to age not one day more. Very well, then. Let me die now. On my knees again, the archers cautiously approached, weaker. Hands and knees, the earth and paving spattered with my blood, with Sergei's, with Alex. I'd taken enough shots to kill a dozen men, but still lived. Not right, not natural. No. Laughter for my realization. To age not one day more. I wasn't going to die. Not tonight. Not ever. Laughter for my anguish. 1,000 nights, 1,000 years lay before me. Without her. Alone. Laughter. One of the bastards kicked me. I rolled with it, landed on my back, stared impotently up at their grinning faces. How dare they? How dare anyone? I was a von Zarovich. But I was nothing to them. Only another kill, perhaps more difficult, more stubborn than the rest, but that made for better sport. They laughed, their voices unknowingly joining the vile chorus in my mind. Laughter for my newborn rage. I was looking at dead men. I could not die, but they would. Before another hour passed, I'd send them wailing on their way to rotting hell, all of them, all except the traitor behind them. For him, something special. Who? The one who'd kicked me now passed his bow to another man, then removed his helmet. Leo Delisnia. The scent of fresh blood blossomed into the room, sweeter than any perfume. I opened my mouth and sucked in a ghost of its flavor. Where it floated on the air, not enough. I hungered, I thirsted, I craved more with the keenness that diminished all previous wants to the point of non-existence. Nothing else mattered, but that I immediately answer this overwhelming need. Ignoring the fiery shards of pain lancing through me, I turned over, pushed the floor away, stood. Worried, despite my obviously poor condition, my guard came around to face me, a man as badly torn up as I was should be dead, not standing, not stepping toward him. Smiling. His eyes peeled wide open, and he raised his sword to strike. I knocked it away. The weapon spun from his hand and clanged against the wall, close to where Ilona huddled, with the child. Victor, ever the soldier, instantly dived and grabbed it up, dropping into a fighter's crouch. The remaining guards were only just turning to see what was making the commotion. If my man had had less fear and more wit, he might have been able to escape. I wasn't all that fast, but he froze. I moved in, seized his shoulder and spun him around like a doll so his back was to me, tore off his chain coif. His bared skin stank of iron and rust, damp leather and very old sweat. No matter. A man doesn't turn away from stale bread when he's starving of death, legs flailing, hands clawing futilely to loosen my grip around his waist. He might as well have been wrestling a tree. He screamed, but I heard nothing, deafened as I was by the roar of his rushing blood. Other screams, other yells of fright and anger. They were no more than buzzing flies to me. I took from him all that I could take, emptied him as a bird empties nectar from a flower, until his struggles slowed and stopped and his limp weight hung heavily in my arms. He'd provided enough to dull the agonizing edge of need, but I still hungered. The battlefield silence was gone, replaced by an altogether different sort, the silence of waiting. Dread reigned on one side of the room, joyful anticipation on the other. Leo's men were stricken, motionless, all their eyes on me. These were hard men, and heartless, chosen by him for just those qualities, the kind of men who had no qualms about murdering inconvenient children, as long as it didn't put them out too much and they were well paid. They were about to find out the true price of this job. I lifted the guard's body high and threw it across the room to a knot of men. Some were able to react and dodge, the rest went down and stayed that way. One of the archers knocked an arrow, drew and released as smoothly as if he were on a practice field. It went sharp and deep into my chest. When I'd caught my balance from the blow, he let fly with a second shaft, striking just below the first. He had good training, excellent self-control. The best archers always do. He was starting on his third shot when I reached him, hardly feeling it this time. I pulled the arrows from my body and plunged them into his own, and with little less force than if they'd come from his own bow, he thrashed and went quiet. Leo's men scattered in a wide circle around me. Some made for the doors and temporary escape, temporary only. I'd sworn that none of them would live out this night, and I would keep my word.